Hi, everyone. Welcome to our 2023 Self-Direction Virtual Conference Series. My name is Kate Murray, the President of Applied Self-Direction. Thanks for joining us today for the first session in our conference series. Today's session is an untapped funding approach using Medicaid to pay for live-in caregiver housing and to offset wages for care. I'll run through just a few quick housekeeping issues before we begin. Number one, your microphone has been muted. Due to the volume of attendees, please remain muted during the session. You can submit questions and comments at any time during the session by using the Q&A pod in the lower left-hand corner of the Adobe room. We have time reserved at the end of the session for your questions. All questions and comments will remain anonymous. This session is being recorded and will be available on our website. And closed captioning for the entire conference series is available courtesy of our premier sponsor, eVero. You can access the closed captions by clicking on the closed captioning icon at the top of the Adobe room. I'll now turn things over to James Taves to get us started. James is a senior advisor at Applied Self-Direction and the former acting principal deputy director of the Administration for Community Living.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. So today we want to address the twin crises in long-term care, which loom even larger in the future. And these are things that are known to almost all of you. I mean, first of all, we have chronic staff shortages that have become acute in many areas of the country. And the problem will only get worse with the aging demographic and with the shrinking of the unskilled workforce. Some of the residential providers that I count as friends tell me that in the last year or two, at times they have faced unfilled vacancies of 30 to 50%. And of the filled positions, many of them are subject to very high turnover as well. So obviously that creates huge instability in our long-term care system and really makes it dangerous for vulnerable individuals. The only solution, but I won't get started on that, is probably long-term, some form of immigration reform. But as a country of immigrants, we can't seem to get our heads around that. The second huge crisis is the lack of affordable housing. Single bedroom apartments in most urban areas are well over $1,000 a day, $1,000 a month. SSI this year with the increase is $914 for a single individual, $1,371 for a couple. Well, obviously, if you're paying $1,000 for rent, you've eaten up all your income and have nothing left over for other household expenses. HUD vouchers, Section 8 vouchers, waiting lists are 2 to 3 to 4 years. I've noticed that in some urban areas, they've started lotteries. So you got to win the lottery to actually get on the waiting list. And then you still have a wait of multiple years before you get a voucher. So that doesn't seem like a solution anytime in the near future. So the lack of affordable housing means if you don't own your own home, the chances of being forced into congregate care is very, very, very high. And we all know from the last couple of years of COVID how dangerous these environments become, coupled with the fact that even before COVID, congregate housing also often resulted in a lot of different pathogens being passed and making the health difficult for vulnerable individuals. Then finally, in the housing shortage, you have the institutional bias of Medicaid. Everybody says the institutional bias of Medicaid is the fact that Medicaid requires you to provide institutional services, but home and community-based services are optional. I think perhaps just as or even more insidious is the fact that Medicaid will pay full room and board in institutions and yet completely forbids it on the home and community-based side. And to make things worse, the Office of OIG is starting to investigate states because they suspect providers, long-term care providers on the community side are sneaking into their Medicaid rate part of the payments for room and board. And my reaction to that is, well, of course they are. because even with the collective amounts that a provider can get from the SSI of residents, it still doesn't cover the full room and board costs that the provider must somehow try to absorb outside of Medicaid. I tried to do some research on where this bias came from, the exclusion of room and board, and couldn't find anything in the history, in the legislative record. I've talked to old timers at the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare. Nobody seems to know where this exclusion came from. And yet when you suggest that it needs to be addressed, everyone says that's impossible. We'll never get it done. It may be based on the first Medicaid waiver legislation that was based on the Katie Beckett waiver, as you remember, which allowed a young girl with severe medical needs to come out of the hospital and be served at home. So maybe the assumption was everybody would be in their own home. But again, we don't know the history of that. But today we want to address at least some small steps that we think would address these twin crises. And at the end, maybe talk about ways that we could scale these small steps into being major steps that could have an impact in addressing this crisis. I don't typically like to read slides as I go through a presentation, but some of these seem to get pretty complicated, so I'll try to go through them pretty carefully. These are things you already know, that Medicaid can support activities of daily living and IADL for a person living in their own home. And obviously, a lot of states now permit family members to be hired as personal care workers. But still, for many Medicaid beneficiaries, they have to rely on recruitment from the public at large. A subset of older adults and disabilities have intermittent care needs throughout the day if they're living in their own home, and not necessarily 24/7 care needs. But I found back when I was managing the Medicaid program in the in-home portfolio, those were the hardest workers to recruit, because workers who wanted to do this, excuse me, as profession, wanted to go to one place where they could get all their hours to be paid, and traveling from house to house to house and only doing a couple hours here and there just was very difficult. So actually using a live-in caregiver may be the right choice in these kind of circumstances. For some people, an in-home live-in caregiver can feel invasive of their personal space and privacy, but for many others, there's a fear of isolation. I used to interview a lot of older adults that ended up going into assisted living or other facilities, and often they cited the fear of isolation as one of the primary factors. For a live-in caregiver, also, it helps resolve the issue of nighttime coverage for someone who may need intermittent assistance at night. But of course, again, the biggest problem, if you can't find a family member or a friend, is matching a live-in caregiver to someone who will meet the Medicaid beneficiary's needs. So Medicaid obviously covers long-term care in a person's home if they meet the income limit, which is now 300% of SSI. It's been raised this year to $2,742 a month per person. To be Medicaid eligible, you still have this ridiculous $2,000 asset test, which has been unchanged for, it seems like, forever. And to some extent, eligibility varies from state to state in terms of the level of institutional care that triggers home and community-based eligibility. But for a person meeting the income test and the institutional eligibility test, Medicaid will pay for personal care. But again, as I stated, Medicaid law expressly forbids using federal dollars to cover room and board, food, utilities, rent, mortgage payments, etc. And again, a person on SSI, or even someone between the SSI, $911 a month up to 300% of SSI, can't afford high rents and all their other household expenses. So just illustrating the problem, Jane, as an older adult, is on SSI. A studio apartment costs $800 a month. A one-bedroom apartment costs $1,200. Again, when you factor in those costs, Jane has very, very little left to pay for expenses if she doesn't actually own her home and has to rent. But the good news is Medicaid law makes an important exception to the room and board prohibition. It will pay the room and board the proportionate cost of room and board for someone who lives in the same household as the Medicaid beneficiary, provided that the person is not related to the beneficiary. So it can't be a relation or a family member, but we'll address that later. This is the federal citation in federal law. The first part talks about the prohibition, but the second part highlighted talks about how room and board can be covered for someone living in the same household as the Medicaid consumer or beneficiary, and that assistance of such a caregiver will support the person who otherwise would potentially meet an institutional level of care need. In doing this, the state in its Medicaid waiver application actually has to check a box and say, we're going to do this. We're going to pay room and board costs, the proportionate room and board costs for a live-in caregiver. The state has to describe its method of how those costs will be calculated. And there's some technical details about how you do that in the cost neutrality calculation, but I won't get into that. And the last thing is federal match can't be claimed if the beneficiary lives in the caregiver's home or the residence is owned or leased by a provider of Medicaid services. But federal Medicaid coverage of a non-relative caregiver's room and board greatly expands the Medicaid consumer's access to housing and the rental market, because obviously the consumer will only have to pay 1/2 of the rent and the other room and board costs. And it's pretty easy to calculate the average cost of food and utilities. You can average them over multiple months and turn that into the amount that Medicaid would pay for the live-in caregiver. So in effect, we would argue that the room and board coverage for a live-in caregiver actually acts as a rent subsidy for the Medicaid consumer, and that in many rental markets, this is the only way a Medicaid beneficiary can live at home and receive in-home services. Then, to add to this, you can couple the room and board coverage for the live-in caregiver under Medicaid with a Department of Labor law called the 3M credit, which is something under the Fair Labor Standards Act. Since a self-directing participant, which is the group for self-direction that we all aspire to, if the self-directing participant is an employer under the federal labor FLSA, then the free housing paid for by Medicaid to the live-in caregiver can act as an offset to the pay that otherwise would be required for the caregiver. This 3M benefit can be claimed under the following conditions. The lodging is free, the caregiver accepts the lodging voluntarily, living in the employer's home is a condition of employment, the employee is not forced to live in their existing home just to be on call for the employer. So using the 3M credit, the beneficiary can afford to live at home, the caregiver has free housing, and covering the caregiver's cost can be cost neutral because, again, you're deducting the pay that otherwise would be owed to the caregiver from the amount of free housing they're getting paid for by Medicaid. So there's a couple requirements. The 3M credit, the cost has to be reasonable based on a fair value of the portion of room and board costs attributed to the live-in caregiver. The other cost of utilities, et cetera, have to be correctly apportioned. And an important feature is that Medicaid can be the source of funds that the employer uses to pay for the free housing to the in-home caregiver. So the source of funds is not relevant at this point. So putting an example again to get together, Jane is a 62-year-old woman in a in a wheelchair. SSI is her main source of income. She wants to live in her own place, but housing in her area is way too expensive. She's on a very long wait list for subsidized housing that could take years, but she has a friend, Mary, who's been providing some unpaid support over time. They trust each other, they've learned to appreciate each other, and they agree on a plan to live together and share living expenses. Together, they sign a lease for a $1,400 apartment. Jane enrolls as an employer in self-direction, hires Mary as a caregiver. Mary's portion of the rent, again, half of the $1,400 is $700. And then you divide that into 4 weeks, which is how you calculate pay periods. And so the $700 over the month can be deducted from wages that otherwise would be owed to Mary for providing direct care to Jane. Mary receives this free housing as a benefit of supporting Jane on a part-time basis during the day. And the outcome is achievable without added cost for the Medicaid program because, again, wages are deducted from the free benefit of housing. So to calculate the 3M credit, and I know this seems to get pretty complicated, but it's really not that complicated, but it takes some thinking to sort of figure out all the logistics of this. But to calculate the 3M credit, you would take the hourly rate and you would divide it into hours that are worked in a given week. That credit can go to meet the employer's minimum wage obligation and is included in determining the worker's regular rate of pay. And the 3M credit can stand alone as meeting all the employer's pay obligations, assuming that it matches the number of hours divided into by the amount of free housing that's involved. So to simplify it, if for Mary the 3M credit equals $225 a week, which is a fourth of the $700 that is her share of free housing under Medicaid. If you use the ridiculous, still federal wage minimum wage obligation of $7.25 an hour, you divide that into 225, and that would mean that Mary could work for 31 hours and not have to be paid because of the housing benefit. Obviously, where wages are approaching $13, $14, $15 an hour, that would change that calculation, and you would take that higher calculation of the number of hours to be worked and divide it into that $225 a week. Again, the 3M credit can be the sole payment if it covers the employer's minimum wage obligation. It can also cover if there's a joint employer, which could be an FMS or an agency with choice. Typically, we don't think 3M credits could be allowed if the employee is covered under a collective bargaining agreement, but that would depend on a state where personal care workers are covered under union contracts. To do all this, you have to do careful record keeping. You have to have a written agreement on the shared living arrangement. You'd have to keep records of what the apportioned cost is of lodging and utilities attributed to the caregiver. Other average costs like food and utilities, et cetera, would also have to be calculated as a proportionate share that goes and is paid for by Medicaid to the live-in caregiver. And the state obviously would have to describe how they make all these calculations and how they actually make those payments for the free room and board for the live-in caregiver under their Medicaid waiver application. So to sum this all up, Medicaid payment for the room and board of the live-in caregiver can act like a rent subsidy. And more important, let's face it, many home care workers are really poor. We were talking recently to a health plan in Florida who talked about a lot of home care workers who actually live in their cars or in cheap hotels, can't afford rents. And yet, if they could be matched with the people they're providing personal care support for, their housing needs would be covered, and that would be a huge benefit for home care workers who otherwise are pretty poor. And again, to sum up, the 3M credit can offset wage obligations. And for many beneficiaries who need intermittent support, or even who need 24/7 support, the live-in caregiver can be sort of your base of support, and then you can add wages paid to other workers who might come in during the day or on weekends or something like that. And obviously, for a beneficiary needing 24/7 support, a live-in caregiver can also provide critical nighttime support. And for many beneficiaries, they're simply afraid to be alone at night. So this live-in arrangement can be ideal. So let me turn it over to Kate and talk about a different approach that comes with the same outcome.
All right. Thank you so much, James. That was really informative. Next, we're going to shift gears a little bit. And I think the next section is going to be a little bit more familiar to a lot of folks on today. If you've heard of a federal tax provision called difficulty of care, we're going to talk about that a little bit and how it relates to this live-in caregiver discussion. So I know a lot of you on today have heard of this before, but if you're not familiar with this concept of difficulty of care payments, this is something that the IRS has specifically created as a benefit for workers who are acting as live-in caregivers for Medicaid beneficiaries. And in some cases, maybe the majority of cases, difficulty of care may be a little bit more flexible and easier to administer than 3M, which certainly has huge advantages, but is complex, I think, to think through and scale. And difficulty of care really goes back to back in 2014, which in my head is still very recent. I realize it's almost 10 years ago at this point. The IRS released a notice called Notice 2014-7. It's available online if you just really like reading boring stuff. It's available. And it states that payments who are made to people who live full-time with a Medicaid waiver recipient and are paid to support them, those payments that person is receiving to support that waiver recipient are what's called difficulty of care payments, and they're not wages. And the difference there is that a difficulty of care payment is excludable from federal income. So it's not counted for key benefits calculations, and it's not subject to federal income tax. So it is the worker who qualifies for difficulty of care does not have to have income tax, federal, and in some cases, state income tax withheld from their pay. And unlike the Medicaid authority that James was just talking about to pay room and board for the caregiver, the difficulty of care payment can be used by family caregivers, and it can take place in the home of either the caregiver or the beneficiary. So it gives us a little bit of extra flexibility there, where family members can use difficulty of care. They can qualify. The sole IRS criteria for qualifying for difficulty of care is that you live with a Medicaid waiver recipient and you're providing services to them, and both of you live together full time. And that is it. And it doesn't matter your family relationship, anything else, who owns the home. The IRS just cares that the two of you live together full time and no one has any other home. So like the Medicaid authority to pay room and board for the caregiver, but without some of those restrictions that we were talking about, difficulty of care can, and I would say is being used to recruit live-in caregivers and match them with interested Medicaid beneficiaries. We've seen some small pilots of this approach, and I think there's a lot of potential for growth here based on the successes that we're seeing in those pilots. And caregivers whose pay is not subject to income tax can pay their portion of room and board. And as James was talking about, when the caregiver's room and board is covered, that sort of acts as a rent subsidy for the beneficiary. And then the caregiver also benefits from affordable housing. So difficulty of care, I think, can also be another tool in the arsenal when we're trying to solve for housing affordability, not only for participants, but also for the workers who support them. And I will just say here, I know many of you know this, but this difficulty of care provision, as written by the IRS, only applies in 1915C waiver programs. However, the IRS does allow states to obtain what the IRS calls private letter rulings to use it for Medicaid non-waiver programs. So if you're in a community first choice state, if you are operating in an 1115 context or a 1915I, or a state plan personal care program, difficulty of care is not immediately available unless your state has obtained a private letter ruling where they simply have to kind of write a formal request to the IRS and ask for formal permission. So it's just an extra step. It's not to say that it can't be used. And a lot of community first choice programs and other larger HCBS programs that are not waiver based have gotten those rulings. But I just wanted to flag that for those folks that are operating outside of the 1915C waiver context. So again, we'll put this all together just from a little bit of a different perspective, having just covered that difficulty of care piece, which sort of can help where the restrictions on the live-in caregiver approach that James was talking about doesn't work. So in this example, we have Jane living in a 2-bedroom apartment, which rents for $1,400 a month. Mary is her live-in caregiver, and Medicaid pays Mary's portion of room and board. Food and utilities for the two of them averages about $400 a month. And so Mary's portion of room and board, so rent plus, food and utilities, comes to about $900 a month, which is covered by Medicaid. Jane is assessed in her plan of care to need 4 hours of personal care per day or 28 hours per week to help meet her ADL and IADL needs. Using 3M, Mary's wage requirements are covered for 60 hours a month or 14 hours a week at an hourly rate of $15 per hour. And so to cover the balance of personal care hours that Jane needs after we take into account that credit, Medicaid pays Mary $15 an hour for 52 hours a month or 13 hours per week. So Medicaid pays Mary $15 an hour for 112 hours of personal care per month or 28 hours a week. Mary's net pay is $1,551.48 per month, from which she pays her share of $900 a month for her portion of room and board costs, leaving her $651.48 in monthly disposable income after Social Security and Medicare taxes. So the difficulty of care payment, in this case, makes housing more affordable for Mary, and it can act like a rent subsidy for Jane as well. And under either methodology, Jane benefits from living independently with supports, as well as the companionship of having a roommate. So I realize that was a lot, but we just wanted to explain these concepts and how they work. And just to, as kind of a quick reference, we've put together this table, which kind of compares and contrasts these two approaches. So if you're using the 3M credit, like James was talking about, in conjunction with that Medicaid provision to cover room and board for an unrelated live-in caregiver, one of the restrictions is that the beneficiary can't hire family members as live-in caregivers. If you're using the difficulty of care methodology through the IRS tax provisions that we were talking about, the beneficiary can hire family members as live-in caregivers and have those caregivers' payments be income tax free. The 3M credit can be used by Medicaid beneficiaries with institutional levels of care. Versus if you're using difficulty of care, it can't be used by Medicaid beneficiaries in non-waiver programs unless the state has gotten that private letter ruling, which, I mean, by private letter ruling, I mean special permission from the IRS. If you're using the 3M credit, payments for a live-in caregiver's room and board expenses can be exempted from taxes. When you're using difficulty of care, it may be a little bit more expensive for states because while difficulty of care payments are not subject to federal income tax, they are still subject to Social Security and Medicare taxes and federal and state unemployment tax unless the live-in caregiver is an exempt family member of the participant. So it's a little bit more complicated on that side. And then finally, just to finish up this compare and contrast, with the 3M credit, Beneficiaries with extra space could use that credit to provide lodging for a live-in caregiver and potentially receive, quote unquote, private pay hours at no cost. So if they need more time than more service hours than what they've been assessed to receive, that's a potential option, that 3M credit. And then with the difficulty of care payment, one unique benefit of that is that difficulty of care payments can be counted as wages for purposes of the earned income tax credit, which is a very significant benefit for people who have lower incomes. So that's a question we often get. So I just wanted to clear that up here, where you can sort of get all the benefits of the tax-free payments, but then you can also go ahead and count those difficulty of care payments as earned wages for the earned income tax credit. So it is doubly beneficial for lower income people in that regard. So just to sum up here, I think that one of the big questions outstanding is around scalability in self-direction. There are a lot of benefits to using a live-in arrangement, like James was saying, but are these arrangements scalable? So James, I know you have some thoughts on this, so I'll turn this one over to you.
Well, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of experience with states that have embraced this approach. I think there's the difficulty of care payment is being used pretty broadly in many states, but there's very few states that, only 2 or 3, I think, that have checked the box and saying they're going to use Medicaid to pay for the room and board of the live-in caregiver. So we're at a point where states aren't even really thinking about this or how they would go about doing it. And, part of the reason we're doing these presentations is we're trying to spark an interest for someone to say, wow, this in theory really works. What would it look like practically if we tried to implement such an approach? Obviously, with the difficulty of care payment side, it can include a family member or a relative, where it can't when the Medicaid pays the cost for the live-in roommate or a caregiver. And obviously that's a big distinction, because if you're going to start with an approach on how you match people, you obviously want to do it in concentric circles. Do you have a family member, a friend, an associate, someone from your church or someone else and you keep widening that circle until you sort of face the public at large, from which you have to draw worker support. But I don't think that necessarily represents a barrier if states would really begin to advertise this approach for caregivers. Again, as we mentioned before, many of them are poor to begin with. So free housing would be a huge benefit for them. And in some cases, they then, of course, would get wages on top of the free housing benefit. So we think it solves multiple problems. But how do you scale it? I think you would have to designate certain organizations that become experts in recruiting live-in caregivers, that know how to do it, know how to interview the Medicaid beneficiary along all sort of cultural lines and cultural competency and what their interests are and who would be compatible for them to live with. And then start a matching program to do that. And it would require some broad advertising and detailed sort of case finding and recruiting interviews of that type till you finally got a good match, which probably doesn't meet an emergency need in the short term, but it certainly would on a much longer term and sustained rate. And then, of course, we've talked through all the sort of the angles of how the benefit interfaces with taxes and with other benefits. But in scaling this, states would have to develop a clear track record of the methodology in which you do that. But I don't think that would be that calculated, because most of these costs can be averaged, can be calculated into a formula. You would then have to figure out whether the FMS or what entity actually makes that supplemental payment for the live-in caregiver, how the landlord is paid. Those are logistics that might seem daunting at first, but I think could be worked out. But what we need first is an embrace to say, wow, this could solve some very tricky problems that loom as almost disasters in our support of vulnerable individuals. And we just need someone to stick their toe in the water and eventually, hopefully, jump in. So, Kate?
All right. Well, thank you so much, James. We have some resources here for further information. We realize there's a lot of complexity here. So if you're looking for citations, if you're looking for frequently asked questions from the Department of Labor, we have some IRS resources about difficulty of care. So it's all here in case you want to learn more, and these slides will be made available to attendees. And now we'll turn it over for Q&A. I see lots of really good questions rolling in. So I will start reading them, and we'll just hit as many as we can. So the first question is, due to the caregiver shortages, how can we think about looking to 24-hour models which are high cost and involve Eastern European immigrants? This is a model accessed by self-paying seniors. How can we on the HCBS side access this resource while accessing the permitted self-direction funds allocated to the person? So James, I don't know if you want to take that one, or I certainly have some thoughts as well.
Well, yes, I think I came across one organization, and I'm forgetting the name, that actually is matching not immigrants but college students with older adults, in which, and it's private pay, so it's not Medicaid, and the hours that are worked by the caregiver under private pay can be an offset under the 3M benefit, same as if Medicaid was making the payment. So it doesn't take much of a stretch to say, well, you could turn that same arrangement into a Medicaid arrangement. And I saw another question, and even for seniors who own their own homes and they spend down the Medicaid under the acid test, they can still keep their own homes. The way I read it, they could charge rent to the live-in caregiver, which would be paid for by Medicaid, and in addition then claim the 3M credit as an offset against wages. So I don't think it's a reach to go beyond these private pay arrangements to involve the Medicaid population as well.
Absolutely. And the only other thing I would say on that is working in self-direction, I think the main thing and the reason we don't see more immigrants providing services in these programs is that the worker must be eligible to work in the United States. All states now have requirements where the worker must fill out the I-9 and show that they can legally work in the United States. So we know that the private pay home care industry has a lot of under the table arrangements, but as long as the person is eligible to work in the United States, I mean, as James was saying, I see no reason why there wouldn't be some opportunities there. So we'll move on to the next question. Is it true that the caregiver is having their room and board paid by Medicaid, that they cannot also make an hourly wage for caring for the beneficiary for whom they're providing care? I'll turn that one over to you, James.
Yes. I mean, after you take the 3M benefit, if the 3M doesn't cover the entire wage obligation, then any hours on top of that would have to be paid as wages. So the answer to that is yes.
Great. I'll keep us moving here because we have a lot of questions to get through. The next question is, if the Medicaid recipient owns their home, can they have a live-in caregiver and charge them rent and have that covered?
As I mentioned, I think so. I'm pretty positive about that. But we might have to do a little bit more research on that. But I think the answer is yes.
Great. Next question, or I think it's a comment, is that from a attendee who says, I have experience in intentional community I've had success in supporting people who self-direct and their live-in caregivers develop written roommate agreements. I actually think this is crucial for these kinds of relationships to work. Great comment. The next question
Yeah,
is,
absolutely.
who applies for the 3M credit, the participant or Medicaid?
I don't think you have to apply for the 3M credit, um, but you have to, in your written agreement on how the payments are arranged and the portion that's being covered for the room and board for the live-in caregiver and how their wages are calculated as an offset has to be in a written agreement that would sustain any kind of audit. That's how I think you would apply it. I don't think you have to make an application to the Department of Labor to claim that credit.
Right. It's a matter of documentation, I think. All right, great. I'm just keeping us moving quickly here because we have a lot of questions to get through. The next question is, when you say Jane enrolls as a self-directed employer, is that enrolling in the state system to be a Medicaid provider, or is that working with the FMS as an agency with choice?
All right. That's yours, Kate.
Sure. I think a wire might have gotten crossed. So Jane is a self-directing participant. So she is the waiver recipient in the example we gave. So when she enrolls as a self-directed employer, that means getting set up with the financial management services provider to begin to recruit, select, and hire her own staff. And so her worker would be the one who is, getting, paid potentially by the FMS, having the FMS check that her new hire paperwork is all comes back, the criminal background check and all of that. But in the example that we gave, Jane would be the Medicaid waiver recipient. I'll move us on to the next question. Um, This attendee is seeking clarification. There appears to be a contradiction between, quote unquote, being a condition of employment and not forced. So the full text around, and this is around the 3M credit, is that lodging in the employer's home is a condition of employment and the employee is not forced to leave their existing home just to be on call for the employer. So James, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that one.
The answer is it has to be strictly voluntary. And as I read the regulations, living with a Medicaid beneficiary has to be the primary residence for the live-in caregiver. So that has to be their choice that I'm going to share living with this Medicaid beneficiary and have his costs covered under Medicaid. And it's purely voluntary. I'm not being forced to leave my existing home. If you want to stay in your existing home and just be a paid caregiver for someone, that's a different issue. But I think the key is that it must be a voluntary arrangement.
Great. The next question is, are the live-in and 3M options available in every state?
No, the answer is a resounding no. And we found very few examples of this. Probably the most notable example I found was out of Minnesota, but there they were using the difficulty of care payment, not Medicaid. I think there's Medicaid in one other state that's actually checked the box. They'll use Medicaid to pay for live-in roommates, but we haven't seen any broad scale application of that at this point. And maybe there's some examples out there. If any of you know of these, please let us know.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I mean, as James was saying, and this is, I think, where we run into challenges with states, is that I think not enough states even know that this is an option because it's buried so deeply within the waiver application. So it is technically an option in any 1915C waiver. It's just a matter of checking that box and getting permission from CMS. And as far as the 3M credit, it is something that is allowed under the Fair Labor Standards Act as part of federal law. I would just want to check in any state where I am implementing this option that it is indeed allowed under state law. In most states, I know it is, but there are always some, state law and federal labor law don't always line up perfectly. So that's something I would want to check before implementing as well. I'll move on to the next question. It's a comment. This attendee says, it occurs to me that in an effort to support folks with disabilities, we are inadvertently making the live-in caregivers vulnerable because they don't control their threshold. It's a great comment.
Not quite sure I understand the question.
I think they're saying because the live-in caregiver is relying upon the Medicaid beneficiary for housing, that the caregiver actually loses some control.
Yeah. And there's one other thing we've thought about is, so what if the relationship deteriorates and the live-in caregiver leaves, then suddenly the whole sort of financial foundation around where the beneficiary lives falls apart. I think there are ways to cover it. I know back in my Medicaid operational days, we used to build in vacancy rates or continue payments for rent and other costs temporarily if the person was without primary support, and we had to bring in temporary support. But it's like any plan that involves self-direction, there needs to be a backup plan.
Great. The next question is around what are the state income taxes paid on difficulty of care payments, or any state taxes that must be paid on difficulty of care payments? So this is a great question. The answer varies by state. There are quite a few states that follow the federal rules for difficulty of care. So in those states, difficulty of care payments are not only not subject to federal income tax, but they are also not subject to state income tax. In other states, they have ruled that the state does not follow the federal rules for difficulty of care payments, and so they would be subject to state income tax. So like so many things in self-direction, it's very state specific. And luckily, I find that state departments of revenue have gotten, or whatever your tax agency is, they've gotten a little bit better about making this information more public as difficulty of care payments have become more mainstream since 2014. But if you are not sure, certainly I think the best approach is to try to get an answer in writing from your state tax agency, because not everybody knows what these things are. And, we've certainly heard reports of different people on the phone giving different answers. So an answer in writing is always a good idea. The next question is, so if you're an employee of the Medicaid waiver participant and you're a family member, your wages are exempt from federal taxes under 1915C. So if you are a family member of a waiver recipient who's using 1915C waiver services, the key to qualify for difficulty of care is that you have to live with that person full time. It can't be, you live with them for 4 days a week and then you spend weekends at a different apartment or something like that. You really have to live together full time and have no other home. And if that requirement is met, the payments that you receive from the program to take care of that Medicaid recipient are not subject to federal income tax. Depending on the state that you live in, they may not be subject to state income tax as well. And this is something where you can go and correct your prior tax returns. If you have not been claiming that difficulty of care payment, you can go back and amend old tax returns and get a credit. So definitely something to look into. The next question is there a list of states that have obtained private letter rulings for difficulty of care payments? I would love if this existed. Sometimes the IRS will post private letter rulings, but they'll only post them with all of the taxpayers' information redacted because it's technically a private letter ruling. So this makes it sometimes very difficult to figure out what state they're talking about, since it'll be all blacked out and you can't read it. But I know that California has obtained a private letter ruling, as well as Washington State has obtained a private letter ruling. I don't believe New York has. I'm just thinking of states with very large self-directed programs that are non-waiver programs. I don't believe New York has obtained one. I know there's some stakeholder interest there around getting one for their consumer-directed personal assistance program. But I hope that that's at least a place to start. But if you're trying to find one, I would just Google, IRS difficulty of care, private letter ruling, and your state name. And with any luck, hopefully your state will have posted a non-redacted version of the notice they got from the IRS, which is the reason I know that California and Washington have gotten those rulings. Great, I'll move us on here to the next question. What are the difficulties, if any, that stand in the way of using a live-in caregiver in the home of the family of origin for a person with IDD, or in the home of the adult children for a senior parent?
The only difference I think here is that the Medicaid payment for room and board costs in these situations would not apply because it's a relative, which is excluded from using Medicaid to pay the living caregiver's costs. But obviously, difficulty of care is any arrangement where the caregiver lives together with the Medicaid beneficiary. So I think the latter would apply, but the former would not.
Great.
Does that make sense?
Yes, I agree. And I don't have anything else to add to that great response. Great. The next question is, and I see so many questions rolling in, so I'm trying to get to as many as I can. If a caregiver is paid under difficulty of care and does not pay any federal payments, is there a way for them to be eligible for Social Security and other benefits? So the good news here is that even if a caregiver is receiving difficulty of care payments, in general, those payments are still subject to Social Security and Medicare taxes, unless that individual is a family member who is exempt, a family member of the employer, who is usually the care recipient. So, in general, if you are, unless you are an exempt family member, if you are receiving difficulty of care payments, you are still contributing to Social Security as well as Medicare if you're receiving difficulty of care. So it's really nice in that way, where they're not considered wages for federal income tax purposes, but when it comes to Social Security and Medicare, you still do pay those taxes again, unless you're otherwise exempt as a family member, and you can still pay into those benefits and get those credits. All right, next is, what does it mean that the live-in caregiver might be an exempt family member of the participant, so they might not be subject to Social Security and Medicare taxes and federal and state unemployment taxes when using difficulty of care payments? Great question. So the IRS has some special exemptions in place for family members who are hiring other family members. And I think these were really designed to just make the tax piece easier if, you're a parent trying to hire your child, or vice versa, trying to make it a little bit less formal than would be required under a more formal employment relationship. So the list of family exemptions can be found in IRS. It's called Circular E, the publication 15. There's a section in there about family employees, and this has nothing to do with difficulty of care or waiver issues or anything like that. It's just IRS rules for family members who are hiring other family members. And if you want to read about those and see if you are exempt or not, it is all in IRS publication 15, which is available online. It's the employer's tax guide. Right, I will keep us moving here. The next question is, for participants to figure out the 3M credit and or difficulty of care contract, do they go to the Department of Labor, or where's the best place to inquire more about this? I would say a great place to start if you're a participant is to give your FMS provider a call. Most of them, well, all of them are quite familiar with difficulty of care payments and they can't give you tax advice, but they are likely to be able to point you to more information around how this works in that program. Um, and then as far as the 3M credit, as James was saying earlier, that's something that can really be figured out privately. You don't need to ask the Department of Labor. We do have a link in these slides to a frequently asked questions resource that the Department of Labor has made about the 3M credit. Thank you for scrolling us back here. So if you want to read more about how to do this and how it works, there's a lot of really good information there that's fairly accessible. So I would check that out. And again, it really comes down to maintaining the documentation, having that written agreement to take advantage of that 3M credit. Great. Next question is, can two related or unrelated people live in the same house with the difficulty of care model? And I think they mean two workers. I think this what this question asker is asking about. And yes, so it does not have to be a one-to-one relationship. If a participant has, for example, two live-in caregivers, or if two parents are providing services to their child, very common arrangement, that would still be eligible for difficulty of care, presuming that the parents lived at that house full time. Next question is, can a live-in caregiver who may be a single parent bring their child or children and still qualify for all these benefits? So James, I'll turn that one over to you.
Boy, I'm not quite sure where. So if the Medicaid beneficiary owns the home, I think they can charge rent to the live-in caregiver that can be covered under Medicaid or difficulty of care. But if it's the parent that owns the home, and yet technically under the state, they are the live-in caregiver for their disabled child or adult disabled children. Boy, I'm not quite sure. I think we'd have to do a little more research about how you would apportion those costs. Kate, do you have any other thoughts about that?
My thought is that I don't believe that this is covered in the CMS guidance. So that's something that I'd want to be, I would want to talk to CMS about. Certainly for the IRS difficulty of care, whether the caregiver has children or not, it does not change the analysis. But on the CMS side, I would want to have more clarity from CMS, I think. Right. Next question is, can the 3M approach and difficulty of care payments be used at the same time, or do we have to choose?
Well, yes. I mean, if I was a state, I would check the box and set up the methodology to be able to use Medicaid to cover the live-in caregiver's costs. But I would also, use the difficulty of care payment, and then really you'd have a couple options between who the consumer is, whether the caregiver is related as a family member or unrelated, depending on which approach you would use. And 3M obviously can be combined with the Medicaid payment for the room and board costs for the caregiver.
Great. Well, I see we're right at time, so I will ask one more question, and then I think we can call it here. Thank you all so much for attending. The last question is, do any of these options have to address overtime pay? My state prohibits overtime for employees working under self-direction.
I don't think, and I'd have to go back and research, but the 3M benefit cannot be used to pay for overtime. It can only go to meet whatever the minimum wage obligations for the hours worked are, and not for overtime. on difficulty of care, I think you'd have to pay the overtime costs.
Yes, difficulty of care, you have to pay overtime. And then I will say the Department of Labor resources linked really go in depth into the overtime. So they give some examples and walk you through how 3M works in conjunction with overtime requirements. So that's something to check out for sure. And I'm sorry that we can't get to more questions. I see them continuing to roll in. So these have been great questions. Thank you all so much for attending. I hope this was helpful. As always, please feel free to email us at info@appliedselfdirection.com. If you have further questions or comments, we would love to continue the conversation on this. So thank you all so much, and we will see you soon.